The history of the medieval papacy contains events that require a certain adjustment of expectations before they can be properly understood. The institution of the papacy in the 9th century was not the internationally organized, theologically consistent, diplomatically sophisticated body it would eventually become. It was in significant measure a political prize, one of the most powerful prizes in the Western world, and therefore one of the most violently contested. With this in mind, the events of January 8, 97 in Rome become, if not exactly normal, at least intelligible within their context. Pope Stephen VI, who had occupied the throne of St. Peter since 896, ordered the exhumation of his predecessor Formosus. The body was removed from its tomb, dressed in full papal vestments, and carried to the Basilica of St. John Lateran. It was propped upright in a chair. A deacon was appointed to stand beside the corpse and speak on its behalf. And Pope Stephen opened a formal ecclesiastical trial against the dead man, presiding in full vestments, screaming accusations at a 9-month-old decomposing body. This event is known to history as the Cadaver Synod, or in Latin, the Synodus Horrenda, the Horrible Synod. It is one of the most genuinely strange episodes in the documented history of any institution. It is also, examined carefully, a story about political power, dynastic rivalry, and the uses of legitimacy, themes that are entirely familiar from every era of human history. Pope Formosus had served as pontiff from 891 to 896. He was a man of genuine theological ability and considerable political experience. He had served as a papal legate and as Bishop of Porto before his elevation. But his papacy was conducted in an environment of ruthless factional politics, in which the papacy was a tool of competing aristocratic families and competing claimants to the imperial throne. The specific issue that Stephen raised against the dead Formosus was jurisdictional and canonical. Formosus had previously served as Bishop of Porto before becoming pope. Canonical law held that a bishop could not transfer from one diocese to another, a rule designed to prevent ambitious clerics from trading up to more powerful positions. Formosus had essentially violated this rule twice, once in moving from Porto to Rome, and then in receiving as his own consecration a coronation that Stephen's faction argued was therefore invalid. But the canonical argument was the legal vehicle for a political grievance. The specific political issue at stake was the imperial succession. Formosus had crowned Lambert of Spoleto's rival, the Carolingian claimant Lambert of Carinthia, also known as Arnulf of Carinthia, as Holy Roman Emperor. By crowning a rival to Lambert, Formosus had aligned the papacy against the Spoletan faction that Stephen supported. If Formosus's papal authority could be retroactively invalidated, if he could be found guilty of having been an illegitimate pope, then the imperial coronation he had performed could be declared void, and the political arrangements that flowed from it could be undone. Stephen was not trying to punish a dead man for theological errors. He was trying to use a dead man's conviction to rewrite the political map of 9th century Italy. The trial itself proceeded according to the formal procedures of an ecclesiastical court, with a macabre addition of the corpse in the chair. The appointed deacon answered for the corpse in a thin, frightened voice, as witnesses described it, attempting to mount a defense of Formosus's actions while Stephen raged from the chair of judgment. Contemporary accounts describe Stephen as barely in control of himself, shouting accusations, working himself into a state of fury that observers found alarming even by the standards of a political theater already several steps past ordinary. The verdict was, of course, predetermined. Formosus was found guilty. The vestments were stripped from the corpse. The 3 fingers of his right hand used for ordination were cut off, severing, symbolically, his capacity to have performed any valid ecclesiastical act. The body was dragged through the streets and thrown into the Tiber River, to be disposed of as the body of a criminal rather than buried with the dignity of a pope. The ordinations performed by Formosus, the priests and bishops he had consecrated, were declared invalid. The clergy who had been ordained by him were suddenly, by Stephen's decree, not clergy at all. The immediate reaction among the Roman population and clergy was one of revulsion that appears to have been more visceral and widespread than Stephen had anticipated. The Cadaver Synod is often cited as having crossed a threshold of what medieval Rome's inhabitants could accommodate, even within a culture of brutal political violence. Stephen had done many things that were acceptable in the context of 9th century papal politics. Putting a rotting corpse on trial appears to have been one thing too many. Within months of the Cadaver Synod, Stephen's position collapsed. A popular uprising in Rome, apparently motivated at least in part by revulsion at the Synod and its aftermath, resulted in Stephen's arrest. He was stripped of his papal vestments, imprisoned, and strangled, murdered in his cell, almost certainly on the orders of political rivals who had been waiting for the opportunity his overreach had created. His successors rapidly reversed the proceedings. Formosis's body, which had been retrieved from the Tiber, apparently by a monk or monks who witnessed its disposal and retrieved it privately, was redressed in papal vestments and reburied with appropriate ceremony. The convictions of the Cadaver Synod were declared void. The clergy who had been invalidated by the proceedings were reinstated. The entire episode, from the exhumation to Stephen's murder to the reversal of the proceedings, occupied approximately 1 year. In that year, 3 additional popes were installed in rapid succession as the Spolitan faction and its rivals maneuvered for control of the throne. The papacy of the late 9th and early 10th century is known to historians as the Pornocracy, or more technically as the Saeculum Obscurum, the Dark Age of the papacy. The Cadaver Synod was not an aberration within this period. It was an extreme expression of dynamics that defined it. The papacy as a political prize, controlled through violence, capable of almost any act in the service of factional interest. What the Cadaver Synod reveals, examined as a historical event rather than as a piece of bizarre trivia, is the nature of legitimacy as a political resource. Stephen did not simply want to defeat his enemies. He wanted to delegitimize them retroactively, to establish not just that they had lost, but that they had never had the right to win. The dead pope's conviction was an attempt to rewrite history, to establish a legal basis for claiming that the imperial coronations, the clerical appointments, and the political arrangements of the previous 5 years had no valid foundation. This is a recognizable political strategy that does not require a corpse to execute. The impulse to invalidate one's opponent's authority rather than merely to defeat them, to establish that they were never legitimate, never truly in possession of the power they exercised, is a persistent feature of political conflict. What made the Cadaver Synod unusual was not the strategy, but the vehicle. Stephen needed Formosus present in the court for the proceedings to have canonical validity. Formosus was dead. Stephen's solution to this problem was both logical within its legal framework and profoundly alien to the sensibilities of virtually every subsequent observer. He was, in the end, probably right that the proceedings required the accused physical presence. He was wrong about how the Romans of his time would receive the spectacle of that presence. Legitimacy, it turned out, had its own limits. Even in 897,